Good morning. In case you haven't been with us, we are working our way through the book of Daniel. And as we do, I hope you will recognize the striking similarities between Babylon and the culture in which we live. Because whether we're willing to acknowledge it or not, the dominant worldview of modern America has very little to do with God. It's debatable whether we could have ever been considered a Christian culture, but what is now abundantly clear in our day is that what has supplanted any semblance of cultural religious practice is an overt pursuit of maximum individual happiness through the maximization of myself. Whereas that might sound like the conclusion by a group observing a bunch of spoiled children on a playground, it's not. It's an observation about the beliefs and praxis of most American adults, sadly even many who claim Jesus is their Lord. But to be fair, this philosophy of living it's not distinctly American, nor is it new on the scene of humanity. In fact, here in Daniel, we'll see it on dazzling display under the leadership of King Nebuchadnezzar. And so the title of the message this morning is The Culture of Me. You will recall last Sunday in chapter 2 that God had given King Nebuchadnezzar a prophetic dream, and in the dream, God warned him that his self-inflated image, remember the image that he saw in the vision, would one day crumble under the ultimate manifestation of the kingdom of God. Nebuchadnezzar's initial response to that, if you recall, was a degree of reverence for God and at least a temporary acknowledgement of his sovereign rule over all things. But instead of allowing that to be a wake-up call to squelch his pride and his self-exaltation, the next thing, as we come to chapter 3, that we see Nebuchadnezzar doing is defiantly deciding to try and counteract his prophetic destruction by making the figurative statue a reality. Look at verse 1. He does this in extravagant fashion. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. If you remember the dream, in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar was represented, God said, by a head of gold. But in making the image, Nebuchadnezzar decides to make the whole statue of himself gold. It was an all-gold image of his own likeness. Its enormous size, 90 foot high and 9 foot wide. It would have been tall and skinny and gleaming in the sun there on the plain of Dura. It would have been visible for miles. It was daunting to behold. But it's significant the location where he decided to set this up. He set it up on the plain of Dura. That, most scholars believe, is the exact same place that the self-seeking sinners of Genesis chapter 11 had once attempted to construct the Tower of Babel. And the purpose of both constructions was the same. They had the same objective. They wanted to make an everlasting name for themselves. There in Dura, Nebuchadnezzar's enormous idol of man's glory would have been striking. It would probably built on a foundation. It was tall and skinny. And the context will show that by this image, Nebuchadnezzar was intending to represent himself as having divine power and that his glory would continue forever. Remember, he's trying to counteract this prophetic dream. His mindset is reiterated, we'll see, Lord willing, in a couple weeks in chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar blatantly, he's looking over Babylon and he says, "Behold, is this not the great Babylon that I have built by my own mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Well, now that the monument to his glory was all finished, All that remained to do was organize the inaugural worship service. Verse 2. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. That emphasis is not accidental. Nebuchadnezzar made this. Nebuchadnezzar set it up. Nebuchadnezzar set it up. The goal of this idolatry was to unify the kingdom of Babylon around one purpose, the exaltation of Nebuchadnezzar. That's why the invitation was nationwide. He included every possible leader, all those names. It's the equivalent of the town councilmen and the mayors, all the way up to members of the Supreme Court. They were all commanded to gather for the formal consecration to this idol of self. That's our first point of application. The culture of me demands all your worship. It would seem rational that when people glory in themselves, that such myopic self-delight would be fulfilling. It'd be satisfying. But it never is. Have you noticed that? It never is. In the same way that he who loves money will never be satisfied with money, lovers of me, myself, and I, regardless of how much fame they achieve, always come up empty and distraught. And so, I hope you've observed this in life. To overcome this shortfall, self-promoters become like a sinkhole. You ever seen a sinkhole just open up on a street or somewhere in a pasture, and everything is sucked into it? It becomes like a vacuum. Self-promoters seek to suck as many others into magnifying their image, or we might say their NIL, as is humanly possible. Perhaps you've noticed both in the political arena and from content creators on social media that this adoration may begin as a suggestion, but it soon evolves into a demand. Look at verse 4. It's what happened in Babylon. And the herald proclaimed, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages." Notice the global implication. That when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Remember, they didn't have the benefit like we do of sound amplification. So these numbers of instruments must have been vast. They assembled them from all over the country. But the description, he says here, every kind of music, seems to indicate that this was not a symphony orchestra. This was not designed to create a beautiful, harmonious sound, but an intentional cacophony of discordant sounds meant to convey the dominant power and unilateral authority of Nebuchadnezzar's regime. And so in essence, much like many musical styles today, rather than a display of creative beauty, this was a concert bearing the earmarks of the author of confusion himself. Those initially assembled at this dedication ceremony are all official representatives of the diverse population of Babylon. And so the clear implication of the breadth of the assembly is that this activity is now designed to not only synthesize the citizens of Babylon, but every tribe and tongue and nation will ultimately be expected to be unified under the exalted Nebuchadnezzar. Note how the worship director was given the full authority of the State Department, not only to direct the National Orchestra, but to command all nations to fall down and give glory to Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. While every corrupt government in history has followed this pattern, and we do need to be on guard against similar demands for primary allegiance from our government, let's bring this application even closer to home. Social media over the past 20 years has enabled the masses to imbibe the culture of me on a global scale. Whether you frequent any form of self-broadcast on the internet or not, ask God now to search your heart and see if ever so subtly, at the heart level, your desires and expectations are eerily similar to Nebuchadnezzar's. Some questions. Do you feel slighted if your post doesn't get the same attention or same number of likes or comments that others do? Or if you'll allow me to get even more direct, do you take offense at how few people come to say hi to you at the welcome time compared to the fellowship you see others enjoying? As people who have been made whole in the righteousness of Christ, as people who have been filled with the love of God in Christ Jesus, God causes us to get our eyes off of ourself and our needs and seek to be a blessing to other people, to seek to be conduits of his love and grace to other people because we're satisfied with him alone. Christ has liberated us to think of ourselves last, not first. That's countercultural. That's counter-fleshly. Our mission in life is to benefit others, to actively bless others, especially our brothers and sisters in the Lord. Well, the second point of application is that the culture of me threatens harm on all who abstain. I don't know if you notice, some people it seems like can drive for weeks without noticing the warning lights on the dash of their car, but what they're there for, especially if they're flashing, is to say something under the hood needs attention. Something you can't see, but is very important, needs to be addressed. Well, the clearest indicator of the culture of me ruling your heart is your attitude towards those who fail to meet your expectations and their admiration of you. It is your flesh, not the Holy Spirit, that leads you to only care about those who seem to like you. Any who fail to serve your objective of being well-liked are first of all loathed. Check this in your own life. They're first of all loathed and then even secretly somehow done away with. You ever heard the phrase, oh, they're dead to me? Well, Nebuchadnezzar did have the authority not only to execute anyone who didn't comply with his demands to participate in the inflation of himself, but here he literally turns up the heat in the manner in which they would die if they refused to conform to his will. And just as we see in our world today, since cultural approval was the population's highest value, everyone in that society bowed to any idol which the cultural influencers demanded that they must. Look at verse 6. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, imagine it just playing all at once, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The threat says that you will immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. That means it was already lit It was already going, anticipating that some would not comply. And presto, it worked. The whole world was now under Nebuchadnezzar's control. They were bowed at the feet of his larger-than-life image. That is, except a few foreigners. 3 Jewish young men who had recently been given positions of authority, much to the chagrin of the Chaldeans, some local astrologers who had formerly enjoyed that status. Look at verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." The first thing that these malicious accusers do is strike the chord right after the king's heart. You, O king, live forever. We've discovered some rebels in your regime. Not only do they disregard your lesser gods, we have so many gods, that wouldn't be a big deal, but they pay no attention to you. They have ignored your royal decree to bow to your spectacular image. I mean, who could not bow to that? It's so glorious. Instead, they maintain their highest allegiance to some foreign god who brashly demands that his commands supersede all others. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was outraged to hear of this obstinate failure to comply with his will, just as it does with any of us, whenever we have demanded that things must go our way or else we get mad. Look at verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. It's significant that even these pagans are using their Hebrew names, even though this section is written in Aramaic, the language of Babylon. That Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true? I'm not willing to believe it, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you who I've promoted recently, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Careful readers will notice two things here. First of all, where's Daniel? Why is Daniel not called on the carpet? Some speculate he had arranged to be away on business, knowing that this national festival was coming. But remember, they're going to go after him later. And remember that God is sovereign over all the affairs of men. And so the teaching point here is that the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was not dependent on Daniel's fortitude. Just like young people, there will soon come a test in your life when you will no longer be able to depend on mom and dad's faith to help you resist sin. You will have to stand for yourself on Christ alone, or you will capitulate to the culture. This test of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would prove, and it did, that their faith produced the personal conviction and resolve necessary to stand firm in the face of life or death trials. Second thing careful readers will notice is that even though Babylon had attempted to deconstruct the faith of these young men of God, their faith stood firm. Nebuchadnezzar was full of rage that these ungrateful appointees had defied his national decree. And so just to go the extra mile, he gives them one more chance to go with the flow, to get with the program. Let's try this again, boys. When the music sounds, prostrate yourselves and worship my image. If you do, we're good. It's cool. But if not, my sovereign decree is your immediate destruction in the fiery hell I have prepared for all who oppose me. Either turn or burn. Because not even this God you're seeking to be loyal to is stronger than me. So the stage was set, and the curtain comes up on the day for which Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were born. Just like we'll see later in the book of Esther, this is there such a time as this moment. Verse 16. Pardon me. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." This goal line stand of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is a precursor to the perfect resolution of our Lord Jesus Christ when he stood before Pilate and was threatened with crucifixion and asked to deny that he is a king. Jesus stood firm. And for these boys, the position they held and stood fast upon did not come about in that moment. It was not a all of a sudden they just had this supernatural faith. No, it was decided. It was developed long ahead of time, long before. And so must your vow to God be your anchor in times of temptation that will certainly come. Even now, by the grace of God, you can pledge your allegiance to the Lamb. You can ask him to not only develop your faith, which is the objective of this whole chapter, to develop your faith, but to give you grace in the day that may come to stand firm for his glory instead of bowing to the culture. These young men stood firm in the midst of an entire nation that was sold out to sin. And even when threatened with being scorched to death, they refused to stop trusting in the power of our God, of their God, declaring, "Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from your furnace or whatever you have." But their goal was not ultimately to save their skin from the fire, but to demonstrate faithfulness to their God in whose wisdom they trusted. This is really important because this is not a name it or claim it type situation. They finished their declaration with, "Even if our God chooses not to save us from death, O king, we refuse to bow to your gods." I was looking up last night about Melanchthon and Huss and other men of God who were burned at the stake for refusing to bow to Catholicism. They stood firm in their Reformation belief. I wonder if the Lord might be leading some of you right now to make the same declaration in the midst of whatever temptations you're facing. You will stand firm. It can be a lonely business, standing firm, but it doesn't have to be. It's instructive here that God enabled Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be a cord of three strands that was not easily broken. In other words, each of them had two brothers in the Lord to link arms with. That's the reason why we ask members of our church to commit not only to gathering here on Sunday morning, but in small group fellowship, in Bible studies, and in many cases, one-on-one discipling relationships, because we need to have that collective, courageous ability to build up one another's faith and to prepare not only for what may come externally, but the temptations that arise in our own hearts. Some of you think, I'm so busy, why bother with that? Well, Paul tells you, Ephesians 6:12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. This is not a human endeavor. This is a spiritual battle. But against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. I say it all the time. I'm going to say it again. There's only two teams on the field. God's team, and everybody who is not with God is in league with Satan. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Do you know that 16 other times, I'm not even counting Peter, 16 other times in his letters, Paul uses that phrase and exhorts us to stand firm in the faith. Martin Luther, here I stand, I can do no other. See, God hasn't called the church to change the culture. You hear that? God has not called the church to change the culture, especially by gradually conforming to the culture. We have been rescued from this Babylon in which we live in order to stand firm in our faith against the tide of the culture of me, while prayerfully seeking to snatch others from the vacuum of its grasp. Just as God used his word through others to rescue us from the eternal fiery furnace that's far worse than the one Nebuchadnezzar built, God wants to use us to graciously help others be set upon the immovable rock of Christ. And because we're on the immovable rock of Christ, we don't have to fear. We don't have to worry about what may come, because God is with us, even in the midst of a culture of me. Last point of application. Our God is able to rescue us. As we look around the culture, it's easy to be dismayed, discouraged. But if you currently live in dread, if you're consumed with the fear that our government will soon demand that not only you conform to whatever cultural norms they espouse or ascribe to, but ultimately that everyone will bow down, as it were, to the state as our ultimate authority and source of direction, I suggest that you may be overlooking a more imminent threat to your faithfulness to God. That threat is that as a citizen of the culture of me, you need to first cry out to God to save you from yourself, to deliver you from always looking out for number one, to give you grace today to turn away from a lifestyle dependent upon the approval and admiration of others. That's what it means to take up your cross and follow Jesus, to live for his glory instead of your own. For it's through you standing firm against such daily heart-level temptations which plague all of us that God builds up your faith to be able to withstand any external demands for you to capitulate to the culture and deny him. Because no matter how extreme their threats are, no matter how powerful they seem, you will already experientially know, pardon me, that your God is able to deliver you, that he is stronger. Look at verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind, it's important, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, all of which are flammable. And they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning, fiery furnace. This is the ultimate God versus man battle. Nebuchadnezzar first calls upon the strongest men from his army. Some say it was his bodyguard, we don't know, to bind these servants, to wrap them in ropes. And the very fire which Nebuchadnezzar lit for their destruction torched his own soldiers. It was so hot. Matthew Henry made this astute observation. God punished these persecutors of his servants, the men who threw them in, not only in the very act of their sin, but by it. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't care. That's the cost of doing business. You know, you lose some. And he sat down, as you might, around a campfire to watch these 3 rebels against his will burn. But wait, verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. This is probably my favorite 2 verses in all of the Old Testament. This miracle blew Nebuchadnezzar's carnal mind. He was so astonished, he couldn't even recall how many men he threw in. What, wasn't it 3? And his counselor said, yeah, king, that's right. But there are 4 men in the fire. 4 men in the fire. Notice that, you careful interpreters. And none of them are affected by the fire at all. In fact, they're walking around like they're in a garden in the midst of the flames. They're just having a good time in the midst of the flames. What a picture. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar noticed, the very fire that I discerned for their doom has now burnt the ropes of their bondage. That is so rich. They're free, like calves skipping from a stall. So it is when God allows you who love him to go through fiery trials. He makes you this promise in Isaiah 43. Fear not. Some of you may be on the precipice of some really fearful situations. Fear not. For I, sovereign God, have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. That's his verbal wrapping of his arms around you in a stronghold that cannot be permeated. You are mine. When you walk, not if. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. The author of The Firm Foundation was aptly applying this reality when he wrote the lyric, when through fiery trials I call you to go, the flame shall not hurt thee. I only design thy, what? Dross, the impurities. You know what dross is? As you melt metal, like your faith is gold, the impurities rise to the top. They can be scooped off and then boiled again, and more impurities so that your faith is increasingly purified. Thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. Now, even Nebuchadnezzar could see that the gold on display was not the man-made statue the culture was busy worshiping, but the pure golden faith of God's servants. Same is true of you who wish to stand for Jesus in our day. Fire is coming. It is coming. But God is sovereign over the fire. And he plans to use it to show off the unstoppable power of the faith which he has imparted to you and which you are a steward of. You're going to be held accountable to exercise the faith that God has given you as a gift. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6. In this you rejoice. In other words, the promises of the gospel. Though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that, why am I going through this, Lord? So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold, that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Nebuchadnezzar was awestruck. How could this happen? This is weird. Whereas some interpreters say that this fourth man in the fire, whom Nebuchadnezzar declared to be like the son of the gods, was a mere angel of God. I believe he was none other than the pre-incarnate Christ. I believe that he was the same pre-incarnate Christ, the man who stood with Abraham, his friend, on the precipice of Sodom and Gomorrah before he destroyed it. He is the one who not only speaks life into being, he's the author of life, but he sustains all things through his sovereign word. And he, this sovereign God, is there with them in the fire. And he's with you to do in your trial, no matter what it is. He's with you. He said, I will never leave you or forsake you. Some of you are heartbroken over various things. God is with you in the fire. Think about this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, enjoyed far deeper fellowship with God in the fire than they ever had before, or probably ever did after that until they saw him. The same Son of God now promises you, as I mentioned, Hebrews 13:5, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Now, in our story, Nebuchadnezzar finally understands the true identity of these three men, and this is significant because it's your true identity too if you're a follower of Jesus. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. Remember the challenge he had issued? Who is the God who can deliver you out of my hands? Now he gets the answer. And he finally calls them by their appropriate title. You guys are servants of God Most High. The one who opens and no one shuts, the one who shuts and no man can open. That is so critical in your identity, in my identity. I want to encourage you in a practice. Every time today and tonight and the next day and the day after that, a temptation hits your mind. Say, nope, not an option. I'm servant of the Most High God. Every time you're tempted to be focused on the vacuum of your own needs, say, God is my portion. God is my shepherd, and I'm a servant of the Most High God. Lord, I'm presenting myself as a living sacrifice. Use me. One day I will be with you. One day I will see your glory. But for now, I have been designated servant of the Most High God in the culture of me. Use me. Shine through me. Purify my faith, God. The enemies of God will only see the reality of God's sovereign power as they watch him protect and preserve you even in the midst of affliction. The question remains, is that enough for you? Or do you want more? Is it enough for God Most High to name you by name as his servants? Well, by this point, no longer was anyone in Babylon paying attention to the statue. Verse 27. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselor gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. They came out smelling like a rose. Not even the smell of the trial was left to linger. This miraculous preservation had happened not only to bring God glory in that moment, but it's a vivid illustration of Jesus' promises to us as we stand firm here in our culture. Luke 21:17. Remember, our preoccupation is to be liked, servant of the Most High God. You will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your lives. God gets glory as we go through the fire rather than capitulate to the culture. Nebuchadnezzar suddenly discovered something better than focusing on his own self-maximization. Verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel, his messenger, and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than to serve and worship any god except their own God. That's the call that God extends to all who wish to follow him. Instead of being conformed to the culture, instead of going with the flow, to say, Lord, I'm your servant. I want to follow you. I want to take up my cross. I want to turn from my preoccupation with me and follow Jesus and bring him glory with my life. And if that's true of you, there's grace available right now for you to cry out to the Lord. While God's ultimate objective is to populate his eternal kingdom, not reform earthly cultures, there is a noteworthy leavening effect upon society when God's people are willing to stand firm. We see that happen even here in wicked Babylon, verse 29. Therefore, Nebuchadnezzar speaking, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had still not lost his love for controlling people with threats. But he did rightly declare the supremacy of the only God able to rescue us, first from ourselves, and then, if he chooses, from every external threat that dares to lift its hand against the servant of God Most High. Let's bow in prayer.